Hello and welcome everyone to the Solo Multimedia Podcast, where I give you my unfiltered take straight off the cuff. And today I'm going to be continuing in going over records I missed from the year. This next one is one I'm actually really excited to talk about, not because the record is necessarily like great, although spoiler alert, I think it is pretty great. It's more just because like the band they're essentially a band that have come up in my local scene, I suppose you could say. And I never really got them like initially. It took me a while to really get into them, but I do think they're legitimately like a pretty fucking great new metal band. And that is the band Conjurer with their newest album, Páthos. So, for those who don't know, Conjurer are basically I guess you could say at the very core, they're like a pretty extreme, pretty heavy sludge metal band. They, essentially just give you a lot of stuff that you'll be familiar with if you're into extreme metal, but I think they do a really good job of showing appreciation for a variety of different styles. So on their debut album, Mire, they mostly just delivered a lot of like very heavy sludge metal that had an appreciation for, styles of death metal, styles of black metal, little bits of hardcore peppered in here and there. Maybe even some metalcore and whatnot. So, like, while the band does mostly just play these, like, monolithic, like, mid-paced, chunky riffs with just a ridiculous amount of fierceness, they do have an appreciation for other things that can help differentiate their songs. And going back to Maya, the debut, when I first heard it, I wasn't like super into it by any stretch. I found it was just like a little bit too bleak and one note the whole way through. But after like quite a few listens, I really thought that each track sort of differentiated itself within the level of just like absolute pitch black bleakness that it was kind of delivering, right? And one thing I found really interesting about Conjurer is I think their riff writing is actually like very memorable. So a lot of the songs really just have like an incredibly tight, impactful delivery, with some creative sections on drums and guitars to really deliver something that is legitimately quite memorable. I mean, many of the songs, like Choke has at least, I'd say, 3 riffs I think are super memorable. Wretch, just the entire song being only 3 minutes, flies by like super quickly, but it's still like very, very just memorable for sure. And honestly, I would say that goes for basically every track. Almost every track on that record definitely had a lot of riffs that I could really like picture in my mind if I focused on it for like a couple minutes, or well, not that long actually, a couple seconds really. A couple minutes I guess wouldn't be that impressive, but hey. So essentially, if you've never listened to the band, I'd highly recommend Mire. I think it's actually one of the better metal records we got from last decade. I really, really fucking adore it at this point. I think it's a brilliant record. I will say that it definitely is something that you can tell is essentially coming from a band that don't have like the most kind of defined identity yet. They're very much still just like a metal band heavily drawing from sludge. But again, I still think it was a very, very promising debut. So naturally, after you deliver something that is essentially a bunch of bangers with all the like super memorable, like heavy, just hard as nails riffing, one of the more logical things to do is to move into a sound that's slightly more expansive and ambitious, and that's pretty much exactly what Conjurer go for on Páthos. So you're getting a lot more sections with a lot more melody. There's a lot more like ultra monolithic, almost like post-metally sections with these kind of like very melodic chord progressions that keep true to this like wall of sound, sludgy thickness that I can really, really appreciate for sure. And I gotta say, when I first heard this record, it was definitely a case of like, okay, I'm not necessarily super into this, but I had this exact same thing with Maya, so I'm going to give it a little longer to really like work out my thoughts on it. But I found it was just like, again, a bit too bleak and a bit too like indistinct to really, really like, I guess latch onto anything in specific, especially on like a first few listens. But over quite a few more listens actually. It's almost weird calling this one like a first impression, to be honest. This is probably somewhere between that and a review, but whatever. This one's definitely like, it definitely is like slightly more indistinct than the first one, I think, but it definitely, has elements that you can tell the band have worked on a lot, and, there is something to show for that trade-off in less memorable riffing, and I definitely think there's many sections on this record that they could not have pulled off on the first one, because they're just going for something that, even from a production perspective, is more ambitious with more like acoustic guitars and clean sections. Many of the vocals are like layered in a kind of more interesting way than on the first record too. So the vocals you generally get across both of these albums are so there's two main vocalists as far as I'm aware. Both the guitarists cover duties, and one of them has like a much deeper like growl, and the other one has a very like ear piercing scream, something more akin to a hardcore band. And the two complement each other really goddamn well on both records. But this is definitely one where I feel like they're starting to play off each other a bit more naturally. So yeah, that's really cool to see. But I guess we should essentially just get into the tracks. I have my notes minimized like a muppet. There we go. So right off the get-go, with the track It Dwells, you pretty much get like this opening of a brief acoustic guitar intro before busting in with a slightly more expansive melodic sludge sound than what you're used to with the band, which definitely signals everything that I've said up until this point. But I will say that I love everything about the first part of this song. It clearly signals, like I said, what the band is doing in the change of direction, but it also shows you that, okay, this is something you're definitely going to be familiar with. It's not going like super far outside of what Conjurer have done on Mire, but it's, definitely still like a step up in terms of ambition. And overall, just this song is one that you're going to get a lot of over the course of this record. It's like essentially a 7-minute sludge metal like odyssey of a track with lots of winding sections, including, like I said, the extra flash in the production. But of course, it still has those like monstrously huge sounding riffs. The riff in particular at 2 minutes 50, I think, is a huge standout for me. And it brings in like nice little variations with these like sharp angular panic chords that I really, really like. The track closes out with an almost like post-metal sounding section that once again hits on the more ambitious nature of this record in general. So yeah, it's just a really goddamn solid, really, really like good opener. I would actually say it's probably a highlight on the record. I'm a huge fan of the track It Dwells. I really, really like it. The next song, Rot, opens with this very strange sounding like ominous set of guitar licks and strange percussion that kind of sounds like there's lots of like reverb and an echo added to it to add to this kind of like ominous intro. But overall, I'd say this track is probably most in line with anything off Mire. It kicks off with this like super tight syncopated chugging riff dispersed with discordant notes that wouldn't sound out of place on a Knocked Loose track. This is possibly the only moment on this new record that harkens back to those like slightly hardcore or metalcore sounding sections on Mire. But the verses on this one are largely driven by incredibly harsh vocals over these really sparse riffs, letting the distortion and feedback work to build most of the atmosphere. And the song largely plays off a core rhythm that has plenty of little variations and touches within it to keep it fresh and interesting throughout the whole length of the song essentially. There's like a pretty interesting little tom groove in the middle section too. Overall, I would say I like this track decently, but I wouldn't exactly call it a highlight. I would absolute shout out to the final breakdown at the end though. It's just this slow, like sludgy riff with the most disgusting death scrape I think I've heard recorded, because it just, oh my god, it works so well with the just ultra sludgy chugs that it kind of builds into. So yeah, the death scrapes are like on the end of every single measure of the riff, and it works disgustingly well. So huge shout out to that part in particular. The next track is called All You Will Remember, and this one definitely embraces many of the newer elements of the band's sound, in it being like this absolutely monolithic sounding lengthy track with plenty of these kind of like depressive melodic riffs that almost hit in the same way as Mirror Reaper by Bellwitch, only obviously a lot faster. It's not to say it's fast, but that record is like incredibly slow, like deathly slow almost. This track includes some cleans that go over like really well, I think, and help add a lot of personality to what is ultimately like a very bleak track. And while it isn't the most densely detailed song, the sheer force of the atmosphere it crafts is immensely satisfying to sink right into, and I feel like it has enough ideas to never feel too slow. So this was definitely a highlight in the track listening for me, even if it was like mostly just like a very atmospheric mid-paced song. And I'm a sucker for the black gaze section towards the end. It really feels like something they couldn't have pulled off on Mire, but it's just such a perfect fit to close out the track for sure. The next track, Basilisk, is kind of like, it's a bit of an odd one. So This one is I would almost say it's somewhere between like the ultra expansive sound, because a lot of this song is very wall of noisy with lots of ultra distorted warm guitars across the board, but it's only like 5 minutes in length and isn't like the most detailed song on the record. I would say it's actually probably for me one of the more forgettable ones. It definitely wasn't like a highlight for sure. I really appreciated the blending of the two records on this one to some extent, but overall it didn't really stand out massively in the track listing to me. I didn't feel like it had enough detail. It wasn't a highlight. I don't really know what else to say. But that's, completely fine, because the next track, Those Years Contemned, kind of brings it back in a pretty big way. It opens with an acoustic guitar that is playing this kind of like melancholic chord progression, and eventually the drum and bass come in to play over the acoustic, and it slowly builds before exploding into another huge expansive section. This develops into like this pretty staggered, almost off-kilter sludge riff that stands out as particularly fierce and shows off the band's ability to play incredibly tight passages that really heavily rely on the playing to just be as impactful as they are. I do love this song, as it's another one of those like winding tracks with just loads of really clever moments, like the re-implementation of the intro progression as the chorus that flows into this just crushing double bass section. And I think for sure these like really expansive kind of like 7-minute just winding Odyssey style tracks are where the band are at their best, because they can just flex their appreciation for a variety of sounds within extreme metal and tie it all together with this sludge lens. So yeah, just for sure, another big highlight in the track listing for me. The next track is kind of in a league of its own. Interestingly, it's the single like short track. It's only 2.5 minutes, and it's essentially just this like ultra speedy jam, opening with like a D beat that's peppered with blast beats, complemented by like a killer riff that just whips the listener, especially with the little rhythmic variations that are played over the course of the core riff. Overall, the track is just a nice, short little, like, ultra speedy tune with lots of ideas. It's got a great sense of forward momentum. It's got killer riffs, and it's definitely a welcome break from all the monolithic, kind of like emotionally draining song. It ends perfectly and flows into the next song beautifully, which is again another one of these kind of like slow, sludgy, like monolithic sounding tunes. But Jesus Christ, like the riff on this track is one of the most memorable and one of the thickest of the entire record. It's definitely one of my favorites. Like I said, it's memorable, it's catchy, it's utterly crushing, and the fact that it serves as the core for the rest of this song is just perfect. Naturally, the track is another incredibly expansive song with lots of winding passages, killer breakdowns, tender quiet sections, probably one of the most harrowing passages on the entire record, around 4 minutes. Like, I'm a huge fan of that section. The way that the vocals worked into it is just, yeah, it just sounds absolutely harrowing. I will say that, like, as a really minor nitpick that I don't have for many of these songs, I wasn't a huge fan of the clean vocals on the back end. I think it's literally just one line, but something about how melodic it is juxtaposed against how kind of like just harsh the point at which it comes up on just doesn't work for me. Something about them just kind of like drags me out of the atmosphere at that point. But like I said, it's really a nitpick, and this song is another like huge highlight on the record in my opinion. And then finally we get to Cracks of the Pyre, which is essentially just another 7-minute monster track, opening with what sounds like the flowing water of a river before some clean guitars and strange stuttering whispered vocals take the charge. Once the whole band kicks in, you get one of the more like melodic songs on the record. It's got some bright guitar leads around a third into the track, which are almost like weirdly bright and melodic for this record, but they work really nicely. But largely the song is focused on less heavy and more warm wall of sound style guitars and chord progressions. I really love the acoustic break at 4 minutes. It's actually probably my favourite one on the record, just because it's pretty distinct, especially for an acoustic part on this record, I would say. And it also goes perfectly into like the next very melodic heavy section. It's a decent closer, but I would say it does feel just a touch indistinct at this point on the record, especially after you get so many of these like ultra expansive songs. So overall, I gotta say, there's really a lot to appreciate on this record. And while I don't think everything goes over like quite as well as it could have, I still think this is just like, is such another kind of like it's a reaffirmation. Oh God, what's the word? A reaffirmation, I think that's the word, that this band essentially like know what they're doing within the genres they're playing with. They're an incredibly promising upcoming band. They've started to get a lot more popularity, and you can really understand why and see how that's paid off in Páthos. It's clear Mire wasn't a one-off. I would almost actually, a really good comparison point in my opinion to this record would be the band Kvelertak. So the first Kvelertak record was kind of the one that I think a lot of people is their favorite of, essentially. It's got all the like bangers on it. It shows the band's capabilities and appreciation for the genres they're dabbling in right off the bat. It's ultra memorable, ultra catchy. And then on the second record, they tried to go for something that was a little more, just a little more ambitious, less like strictly speaking catchy, and just more interesting in a lot of ways. But I think for me, on that second Kvelertak record, as is here, it doesn't quite go over as well as the debut, even though I have a huge appreciation for both records. I will say I think this record is a lot better than the second Kvelertak record, because I actually thought, even though it was more ambitious and very interesting in what they were trying to do, I do feel like that band were just much better at writing bangers, but that clearly isn't the case here. Conjurer very, very clearly have an appreciation for everything they're doing and pull it off in, again, mostly a very, very impressive way. So I definitely highly recommend this record for this year. I think it's a great record for sure, and I just can't wait to see what they go on to do next. So that's pretty much everything I have to say about this record. Cheers for listening, and I hope I'll see you around, all right? Peace out, everybody.